Hey y'all, it's Chris with Rockin Farm, and I have gotten a lot of questions and a lot of comments lately about tomato varieties kind of specific to Texas. Before we jump into this too far, please go check out our website, rockin8farm.com. That's ROCKIN, the number 8, FARM.com. Also, if you're not already subscribed to our channel, that's a great way to help out our farm. So hit that subscribe button and click that little ringy bell so you get notifications every time that we post a new video. Now, the tomato varieties I grow here aren't any different than tomato varieties that people grow in other places, but obviously certain tomatoes do better in certain climates. So very specific to Central Texas, we have hot, dry summers here in Central Texas. You have to give lots of water from manual irrigation. So what types of tomatoes do well here? Well, I want to talk about that today, but I want to cover a couple of other things as well. So we have grown a lot of different tomato varieties over the last few years. We've only been gardening in this garden for about 3, so we're still doing some experimenting ourselves. We've had some tomatoes that have just been knocked down, stand out, absolute best. We will grow them every single year. We have some stuff that we've tried and it did okay, but maybe it's not really our thing. And we've also got some new experiments coming up, so I'm going to cover all of those. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about when it comes to growing tomatoes here in Central Texas is that cherry tomatoes in general tend to do better than full-size slicing tomatoes. Now, that's not to say that we can't grow slicing tomatoes here. It's just that if all you want is some tomato flavor, you can mix cherry tomatoes into salsa too. So that you don't have to have the full-size big slicers. The bugs tend to go after the cherry tomatoes a lot less. I don't think we found tomato hornworms on any of our cherry tomatoes at all the last 2 years. Whereas we do have to come out and pick some off every once in a while off of our larger slicer type tomatoes or paste tomatoes, etc. So the pest pressure is lower on the cherry tomatoes. They're very prolific. But even within the cherry tomatoes, we have our favorites. So we grow all the different sizes, but we're kind of starting to find what works really well for us here in Central Texas. The first thing I want to talk about is things that we've grown in the past, and it's not that they were bad, it's just that if you have something that performs so much better, then I don't really see the point in wasting the effort in a certain tomato variety. These black cherry tomatoes, it's not that they did bad, they did good for us. The pest pressure was a little bit higher on them than it was on any of our other cherry type tomato varieties. And they produced well, but they didn't produce as bang up as a couple of our other cherry tomato varieties. And that's why we're going to stick with a couple of old favorites and try a few new things. Now, when it comes to old favorites, I have 2 varieties that I know for an absolute fact I will grow in my garden every single year. The first one is the one that if you go back and watch any of my summertime garden tour videos, you're going to see me bragging about these all the time. And that's your yellow pear tomato. Y'all, you can't beat this for a cherry tomato. They produce like it is nobody's business. I have, between this and the other one that I'm going to mention in a second, I have, we ate these tomatoes until they were coming out of our ears. I canned a lot of them in kind of little Italian-y type pickled style tomatoes to be able to pull out and put in salads for some really bang up flavor. And I probably have about 3 of the big 2.5 gallon Ziploc bags that are just packed to the absolute brim and thrown in the freezer for us to be able to put into salsas or whatever at a later date. These yellow pear tomatoes, they just don't stop producing. They just keep going and going and going through the heat, through the drought, into the fall. We got cherry tomatoes, these yellow pear tomatoes, just they never stopped. So I will grow yellow pear tomatoes in my garden every single solitary year. The other thing is I have always grown these in buckets. So if you're looking at doing some sort of container gardening, now they get bigger than what you would standardly think of as a container garden tomato. So they need something that you can trellis them on or tie them up to. But that was the space that I had to put these in the last couple of years, was 5 gallon buckets full of dirt. And they're totally okay with that. They don't seem to mind at all. The same thing goes for Brad's Atomic Grape. Now, these don't produce as massively as those yellow pear tomatoes do, but you get a ton of fruit off of it. And the fruit is, it's a grape tomato. It's much bigger than like a cherry tomato. So not quite slicing size by any means, although I've been known to take some of the bigger ones and cut slices off of them and then just put like 5 or 6 slices on a sandwich. The flavor on these is unbelievable. The bugs seem to really leave them alone. Now these ones, when it got really hot, they stopped producing. I let them hang out, and as soon as it cooled back off, they started producing again. So just for flavor alone, I will grow this Brad's Atomic Grape tomato every year. A couple of cherry tomatoes that I heard good things about. I'm going to give this one a try. This one is from Haas Tools, and it's the Sweetie cherry tomato. I've heard of quite a few people having pretty good luck with these. So I'm kind of looking at these as like a substitute for that black cherry tomato that I wasn't, super excited about. I've heard that these produce very prolifically as well. So I was looking for another cherry tomato where I knew I was going to get tons of cherry tomatoes. A couple of other things that we're going to try new in the garden this year are more of a bush style tomato. A couple of years ago, I went to the, local big box store. It was kind of that summer to fall transition. They had tomatoes out, and one of them said bush style, and I was like, I'm intrigued. So I grabbed a couple of these bush style tomatoes. I threw them in the garden, and during that time where they started producing up to where it just got cold and froze, they did really well for us. And what I was really kind of impressed with is that they formed kind of a large basket, like a little bit bigger than a basketball size bush. So they didn't take up a ton of room, but we got a lot of little tomatoes off of them. So I looked up a couple of bush style tomatoes that had good reviews and that it seemed like people were interested in growing them, and I decided to give them a try. You're just going to have to watch over the course of the next year to see how these do for us. The first one is also from Haas Tools, and it's the yellow Canary tomato. So again, I can't give you a ton of info on this. You're going to find out as I do. And the other one is this Rosy Finch tomato. So again, 2 bush style tomatoes that we're going to give a go and see how they work out for us. My only experience with these bush style tomatoes is the 2 to 4, I might have been 4 plants that I picked up at the big box store, but I was super happy with them. I don't know what variety they were. Probably some sort of an off-name hybrid from Burpee or one of those other companies. It seems like what a lot of those, the big box stores carry. So we're going to give these bush style tomatoes a try. And like I said earlier with the yellow canaries, you'll just have to watch and see how they do for us. But I was looking for a tomato that didn't take up a whole lot of space. So if they do well for us, then I know that going forward, if I've got so much stuff growing that I'm not sure where I'm going to put my tomatoes, a bush tomato makes a great option. Now, as far as the bigger tomatoes go, I've got 2 tomatoes that did really well for us here as far as the amount of production. I don't know how much I'm going to grow of these again in the future. The first one is a good old Amish paste tomato. We got a ton of Amish paste tomatoes, and they got to be pretty good sized. I would say some of them, they're elongated. So when I say baseball size, just understand it's more like if you squeezed a baseball and made it long as well. But we got some really good sized tomatoes. They are very, very meaty, don't have a whole lot of a liquid content to them because they're a paste tomato, which means that if you slice them up and put them on a sandwich, it's So I'm always looking for that. How can I meet multiple, like when people talk about chickens, they're like, I want a dual purpose bird. And generally speaking, my discoveries have been that if something is dual purpose, it's not really fantastic at either purpose. It's just pretty good at both. So these Amish paste tomatoes, if you're into making your own tomato paste, your own tomato sauce, these are your tomato. They grow unbelievably well here in Central Texas. They slow down when it gets really, really hot, but once it cools off, they will pick right back up. We do not make a whole lot of tomato paste. We do not make a whole lot of tomato sauce. I don't know how much sense these make for us because they're definitely not a tomato that you're just going to take a big slice and put it on a sandwich or dice up and put in a salad. The flavor just isn't quite there. So that brings us to Roma. Obviously, this is an Italian staple. They did well for us here, but I wasn't impressed with the size. We got a ton of Roma tomatoes, but they were all, just kind of yay big. I would say bigger than a golf ball, but maybe racquetball sized ish. So, when I go to the store, I see these great big Roma tomatoes, and, it could have been my fault, could have been a fertilization issue, could have been a nutrient issue. I'm not 100% sure. We got a ton of tomatoes, but we just have to use a whole lot of them to make salsas and whatnot because they're so small. Again, they slowed down when it got really hot, picked right back up when it cooled off. So if you're looking for a Roma tomato, then the regular old Roma tomato from Baker Creek is a great one. It did really well for us. Whether or not we're going to grow it again this year, I haven't decided yet. Now we're coming to two more of my absolute must-haves. One tomato that we grew last year, I was so unbelievably happy with it, I can't even begin to explain it. It doesn't necessarily produce a ton of tomatoes as far as like per shrub per season. It definitely slows way down in the extreme heat, picks right back up when it starts to cool off. I think you're kind of starting to see a little bit of a pattern here when it comes to tomatoes in Central Texas. They do not like 110 degrees, and when we get that hot, our humidity drops considerably lower. So they do not like 110 degrees and 20% humidity days. And the tomatoes are really going to slow down during that period. But when it starts to cool off, when it dips back down a little closer to 100 or the high 90s, and the humidity comes back up to the 30 and 40% range, the tomatoes will always kick back in for us. And that's why for me personally, I don't necessarily plant a fall crop of tomatoes. I might do a little more of that this year, especially with maybe some of the bush styles. But it's been more beneficial for me to baby my tomatoes through the heat when they're not giving me anything to get that second harvest out of them than it is to put those nice young tender plants in the ground when the pest pressure is at its highest, etc. We just have always chosen to kind of nurse those plants through a time when they're not giving us anything so we can get that second harvest. Anyhow, back on topic here. Solar Flare tomato. Y'all, I love this tomato. Nice, big, baseball to small softball sized tomatoes. They grow all those funky little bumps and ridges and patterns like a lot of heirloom tomatoes do. The flavor is absolutely unbelievable. They're a beautiful tomato as well. Really pretty to look like. So, I mean, they're just kind of like eye candy in the garden. They're just so pretty to look at. We only grew 4 plants last year. We sliced all the tomatoes we wanted for sandwiches, and I froze about 2 or 3 2.5 gallon bags full of these. Now, why would I freeze a slicing tomato? It's like use them up, or they're, what's the point? One of the other things about this Solar Flare that I've been really impressed with, it's a very meaty tomato. It has a relatively low moisture content for a slicer style tomato. It's not as low of a moisture content and it's not as meaty as a paste tomato, but the walls are really, really thick. There's a lot of good meat on the tomato, not a whole lot of seedy area and watery area. So we're thinking that this is actually going to be a pretty good salsa tomato for us because the flavor is to die for and the water content is relatively low. I will grow Solar Flares every year as long as I can find the seed. And one of the other things that we're going to get a lot better about this year is seed saving ourselves. So I'll make sure I'm picking, the greatest, biggest tomatoes off of this that are the most beautiful and don't have bug damage, and pulling seed off of those and seeing if I can get some good genetics out of these particular seeds so I can grow them year after year. For now, getting them from Baker Creek is not a problem. I just want to make sure I have that seed saving ability just in case these get hard to find. Now, the other thing I want to talk to you about here in Central Texas, and Central Texas obviously can be defined as a pretty broad, wide area. People down in San Marcos consider themselves in Central Texas. Over in Bastrop, they consider themselves Central Texas. We're up closer to the Killeen, Fort Hood area. We consider ourselves Central Texas. We're talking about a 75-mile triangle. It's like 60 miles from San Marcos to Bastrop, 65 from here to Bastrop to here, and 75 from here down to San Marcos. So we're talking about a pretty big area there that is considered Central Texas, and the heat is different, the humidity is different, the moisture is different, the amount of rain is different. So when I say Central Texas, I'm closer to the Killeen Fort Hood area, north of Austin, a couple hours south of Dallas. The weather's pretty different. Like up in Dallas, gets a lot colder. They get a lot more freezes. They also get more rain. It seems to be a little more humid up there. Just it varies, okay? But one thing that we grow, and it's not a tomato, but I feel like it is worth mentioning, are tomatillos. We grow the heck out of tomatillos, and we love growing our tomatillos because A, I love salsa verde. B, they add a really interesting flavor to things when you dice them up and cook with them. The other thing is they don't seem to have basically any pests that really care about them. Blight is not going to be a problem. And like I said, we personally have not had a problem with tomato blight here where we live. But I know people in Bastrop that have horrible time with tomato blight, and up in Dallas that have a horrible time with tomato blight. Why we haven't had issues with blight, I don't know. Maybe it's just not really as prolific in the soil here. Maybe it's the weather conditions. But if you live someplace where blight is a big problem, tomatillos don't seem to care. So it's kind of a tomato alternative in a way. I mean, you're not necessarily going to take a slice of tomatillo and put it on your sandwich. But if you need something you can make salsa out of, if you want to take slices of these and fry them, they kind of have that green tomato characteristic. So if you can't grow tomatoes where you live, it's just pointless. You get a handful of tomatoes and then the plant dies to blight. Give tomatillos a try. So I wish I could have gone a little more into depth, but the problem is we tried some new tomato varieties at the old house that we used to live at. We planted that garden out in the spring and then ended up finding the place that we live now that summer. So we left that garden to a new homeowner, and I don't know how well some of those tomato varieties did. We also lost a lot of our seeds in the move, so I'm not even 100% sure exactly what tomato varieties I planted at that old house. When we moved here in the middle of the summer. It was not the time to be planting anything. So I've had 2 full growing seasons at this house. And that's why these varieties that I mentioned today are the ones that I feel comfortable speaking on. Must-haves I will grow every year: solar flare, yellow pear cherry, and atomic grape tomato. I will grow those every single year because we love them and they do really well for us. I'm going to have to let you know how some of the ones that we're going to try experimenting with go. And I'm still kind of looking for another slicer tomato because I like having options. So if any of you have any suggestions about a really good slicer tomato that you know does well in Central Texas, make sure you let me know, because I am looking to try one more large tomato variety this year. But this is what we have grown or are going to grow. I would love to hear your comments. I would love to answer your questions. So until y'all get to see my garden growing, and until we get to see each other again on the next video, I want everybody to be happy and live healthy.